They are unique, as I mentioned, because they are family stations, and they're something that you won't find in other areas of the country in the same configuration as you find here. So for that alone, they are important.
I know as a kid when I used to come out in the summer, there's nothing to do. I mean, you're totally isolated, you know. I imagine for my brothers and sisters, it's very difficult because you could have no friends that much because, you know, once you left them all on shore.
History, a flashback, and a look at today and tomorrow in the old lighthouses of the Upper River area. When we come back right here on the River.
On the River is brought to you by Freihofer's.
Yes, sir. Chief? Set them all off? Yes, sir. The code. Quick, punch in the code.
I can't remember.
I gave it to you at breakfast.
Now I remember. Freihofer's raspberry crumb cake.
And I love their fresh donuts.
Golden corn muffins.
Sir, we've done it. I said the front lawn! The front lawn!
Always as good as you remember.
Okay, where's the loot?
I don't remember.
What do you mean?
Well, do you remember?
That was 26 years ago. First we had lunch.
Now I remember.
Yeah.
Freihofer's fresh rye bread.
Soft, delicious hamburger buns.
Chewy oatmeal cookies.
Now remember where we left the car?
What car?
Freihofer's. Always as good as you remember.
During the early 1800s, when riverboats frequented the Hudson, the first lighthouses sprung up. Commissioned under the U.S. Coast Guard, they served their duty as self-sufficient navigational aids. However, as modern technology came along, the abandonment and in some cases destruction of many of the structures followed. Out of the 15 original lighthouses from New York City up to Troy, only 7 remain today. In the past, these charming buildings have inspired the imagination of many an artist, often creating a feeling of romanticism. Their mere presence is a nostalgic reminder of an age when lighthouse keepers and their families lived on the river. They maintained the lights and the foghorns for the boats and the ships plying the deep channel. Sitting at the Rondout II Lighthouse in Kingston, architectural consultant Elise Berry tells of the history.
The lighthouse service was first started by George Washington in 1799 when the Montauk Lighthouse was built, or that was the first one commissioned. And then the lighthouse service developed soon after that. It became obvious that seaside locations needed some protection. The Hudson River became more widely used in the early part of the 1800s, and by 1830, between 1830 and 1840, the first lighthouses to mark most of these locations were built. There was one at Esopus, there was one here at Rondout, but closer to the shore. There was one at Saugerties and on up to the Hudson area. Then they found, as the designs were reused in various locations, they found that some of them had design flaws that caused structural deterioration of the buildings within about 20 to 30 years. So in Esopus, for example, which is just south of here, the building that exists now was built in 1871. It's the only frame structure. The rest of them were built in brick in this location. But you will find the twin of that building, for example, sat in the Colchester Reef Lighthouse in Lake Champlain. They were stock plans developed by the Lighthouse Service, and they would just be reused with small modifications as needed. Here in Rondout, this lighthouse was built in 1913, which makes it the newest of the lighthouses here in the Hudson. One of the older ones that remains from the second building session is the one at Saugerties, which was built in 1869. The first one there had been built in the 1840s also, but after about 25 years, it was badly deteriorated because of the ice and the other weather conditions that they were just unaware of. All of the buildings have pilings that go down into the river base. They are at best 10 feet below low water. Then there's a cribbing on top of that. And then the bases begin. Most of them are round, except for here. And they are granite pieces that are built up around the cribbing pieces, so that the granite is actually the basement of most of the structures, surrounds the basement of the house. Then the buildings went up 2 or 3 stories, culminating with the light on the top. The light always went through the roof.
At least at one time up to 15, we're talking just about the Hudson, up to how far? Albany, Troy?
Yes. Albany.
So that's about 150 miles from New York Harbor. And to have 15 of them, that's like an average of one every 10 miles. Isn't that rather extreme?
Well, it would seem so based on the type of commerce on the river today, but in that period of time, the Hudson River was the only highway between Albany and New York. And the Erie Canal opened in 1825, I believe, so shipping became available between points in the western part of the country through the canal down the Hudson River to New York, and then they could be distributed to other points from there, or in the same token, things coming into this country to New York could then be shipped up and through the canal in the opposite direction. So commerce began to increase in the early part of the 1800s, and as the first 10 or 15 years progressed, it became obvious that other locations had various river hazards, and therefore they needed to be marked. This is an inland waterway, and it is surprising that so many buildings would be necessary here. But then the Delaware and Hudson Canal opened, for example, and it opened and brought trade and goods into the Kingston area, and there was a major distribution point for coal at one time. So here there was a lighthouse early on, about 1840, and then it was one at Esopus. There is a very sharp bend in the river, a little south of here around the Hudson Highlands. So at Rockland Lake and at Stony Point and other parts of the Hudson, they needed to have various lighthouses. But because it's an inland waterway, they're not of the same construction as others that most people would recognize. It's not a graduated cylinder with strictly a flight of stairs encircling the outer edge of the building leading to a light. This was what's known as a family station, and all of the Hudson River lighthouses were just that. The family, the keeper and his family, would live here all of the seasons of the year, with the exception in the earlier days of the winter when the river would freeze and there were no ice-breaking boats then. And so the light would be turned off, and very often the keeper would become involved in the ice harvesting industries for ice houses that were also here on the river.
Right.
Then in the spring they'd come back, the family would be here again, and they would row back and forth to shore for their goods and their schooling and so forth. It was operated by the United States Lighthouse Service, and the Lighthouse Service operated it as though it was a branch of the military. They were issued uniforms. They had little brass uniform buttons with an outline of a lighthouse on it. There were snap inspections. They'd have to have the brass on the stair railings cleaned. All of the lenses would be cleaned daily, because when they used whale oil and other oils to burn the light, it would cause a film around the outer edge of the lens, which originally would be glass, and heavily cut prisms and so forth. So that required tremendous maintenance, and so every member of the family really needed to pitch in. It wasn't a very glamorous life. They were issued such things as metal beds and maybe a few chairs, and then they brought some of their personal belongings, but not very much. I think it has more of a romantic appeal now than it would have ever had then. It was truly an occupation then.
Lise, why do we not need lighthouses today as we did in those days? Well,
by the time of the Second World War, I guess, many of the lighthouses were becoming automated. Soon after that, the United States Lighthouse Service was disbanded in about 1938, I believe, when the Coast Guard was organized, and it became a part of the United States Coast Guard, so the buildings fell under their jurisdiction then. So Coast Guard personnel were moved in, and they were given the duties of maintaining the lights. It became less of an importance to have a family station because it was the light that was of importance. It wasn't maintaining the whole building. So it became more of a maintenance problem as time went on. And then by the late 50s and 60s, they started to automate the buildings. In many cases, they changed the lights to a very tall pole with a plastic lens on top, and it would be run by batteries, just checked 2 or 3 times a year. Far less to maintain than a building 2 or 3 stories high with kitchens and baths and bedrooms and so forth. So the buildings were boarded up and left. A lot of them maintained just minimally because of their light. For example, here in Roundout, it was always an active light, and it still is, and it will always be maintained to some degree because of that. At Hudson, it's the same thing. But in Saugerties and in Esopus and in many of the other locations, the lights were removed from the tower and put outside of the structure on the platform and were operated by battery.
Elise, what is being done to restore these lighthouses, to make them as they used to be so that we can all get a good look at them?
They are unique, as I mentioned, because they are family stations, and they're something that you won't find in other areas of the country in the same configuration as you find here. So for that alone, they are important. but they are also navigational aids, and there has always been boating of some kind on this river, either commercial or pleasure boating, and now the pleasure boating is increasing again, and so they are still necessary, but the historic aspect of them is important too. We need to know that the river was important as a commercial thoroughfare at one time. We need to know that it took 15 of them to maintain the traffic on this river. And I think people are interested in that. There is a mystique about a lighthouse and a lighthouse family. Even though the days may not have been pleasurable all the time and the accommodations may not have been deluxe, it still has a great mystique. There is history and there is a lot of romance associated with it. I think that the buildings became of interest to a number of people in the last 10 years, but there was a problem negotiating the release or the long-term use of the buildings from the Coast Guard. They began to realize that they were no longer able to maintain the buildings in the way that they had originally been intended, and so they began to consider the opportunities that would be presented by local historical organizations that were interested in their use.
Such as Saugerties?
Such as Saugerties. I became involved as a consultant a number of years ago, having done my graduate thesis project on the 4 upper lighthouses. I knew a lot about them, and I had had some initial contact with the Coast Guard, so I began organizing groups where necessary in the locations surrounding the lighthouse. For example, at Saugerties, there was a group both from Saugerties and from Tivoli who were interested in this building. It physically is in Saugerties, but the Tivoli people look at it and have as much interest in it as others. So a cooperative effort was undertaken. Meetings were held on both sides of the river, and we organized what's now known as the Saugerties Lighthouse Conservancy. They then began to apply to the Coast Guard for legal ownership of the building, which was a very lengthy process, and it just was achieved in the past 6 months. So they now have outright ownership of it. But that was not the case for the other buildings. That was not an option there.
Some of these lighthouses are being turned into tourist attractions. This one is being suggested as a bed and breakfast. Is that going to be profitable? Can that work?
When I dealt with the Coast Guard, we closely considered those possibilities or those problems that may arise. There were organizations that were interested, and most of them were very newly formed, and they were nonprofit or would soon be as their charters were granted, but they had no funds of their own to take on this kind of responsibility. So it was very necessary in structuring the leasing program, which became the prototype for leasing historic structures in the nation, that there would be a definite long-term commitment so that funding sources would be more likely to fund this kind of project, because outright ownership was not an option, except in that one case. They had to have enough of a long-term commitment, and the 20-year leasing program was able to accomplish that, so that funding sources would feel that they were not giving their money for someone else's project. And the organizations have had some success, but it's a tough market out there for funds of that kind.
There is a problem with access. You just can't drive up to a lighthouse on a Sunday afternoon.
That's true. There are some added difficulties because of that. Hudson, for example, is entirely waterbound, and it will always be. It's almost in the center of the channel, so their access will only be seasonal, and they will have to construct a platform that is in conformance with the Army Corps of Engineers regulations, and it may be one that would have to be removed in the winter, for example, and only be out for certain months of the season, so that visitors would be able to come. At Saugerties, they are on the end of the creek, but presently the ground behind them is not accessible. It is a marshland, it's a protected marshland, and so to cross that would require very definite design plans for a specific walkway that would not interrupt the natural habitat of the animals that are in that marsh. But that is a possibility. It's a very long-range possibility now. As here in Kingston, there is a possibility at some point of constructing a walkway behind the building back to the round-out area, but it's a very long distance, and it also will require the cooperation of the Army Corps of Engineers and so forth to do that.
So nothing comes easy, and it's going to take time.
It will, but there's been a tremendous amount of visitation to the buildings that have already been open, and most people, I think, are under the impression that they want to come in and they want to go up the stairs and they want to see the light. They do have interest in the kinds of furnishings that are in the buildings or the different displays that have been set up for their enjoyment, but the big attraction is the light. And so once the access problems have been overcome, then I think that the visitation will increase. I don't really feel that any organization has had any lack of interest, but unfortunately they have had some maneuverability problems, and that's something that they will always have to overcome. They knew that in the start, and even if it's just a seasonal access, I think that it can still be a successful project.
And Aesopus, what's going to happen with that?
It has some structural problems that have caused the various organizations that have been interested in the past some concern. Again, they're nonprofit organizations, and they don't have a tremendous amount of capital on hand to take on a structurally unsound building if it turns out that that's its problem. It seems, though, that the structural problems of the building have stabilized and that it is, in fact, a crooked building. It lists to one side, and there is some theory as to why it lists, but it seems that an early story that has been circulated was that it was hit early on by heavy ice flows before the time of the ice-breaking boats, and that it caused some severe structural damage. But recent investigation by the Coast Guard Engineering Department has found that in the last 20 years the building has listed less than 5%, so it seems to have found a stable point at this time.
How did you get involved? How did you get started in this? You're an architect and very much into the history of lighthouses. I
began as a graduate student looking for a thesis project. I had done some work on numerous adaptive reuse projects throughout New York City and in surrounding counties. I was from the lower part of New York, in Westchester County, and we never really considered the Hudson as people consider it here. It was an industrial area in that section. Our recreation was mostly on the other side of the county towards the Long Island Sound. And I, too, never thought of a lighthouse as anything more than a graduated cylinder, having seen coast lighthouses in New Jersey and Maine and other places. So I became interested in the structure of the buildings, the different characteristics of them. And I was then even more intrigued as I learned that, for example, the Hudson Lighthouse is the same as the Stepping Stones Lighthouse, which I believe is under the Whitestone Bridge. And the plans were reused, and they were reused to accommodate a family and reused in various locations. So as an adaptive reuse project, I began to consider the 4 buildings here in the Upper Hudson as one large touring project, that there could be different uses in each of the buildings with some possible interior alterations, and yet it could be a river tour where people would start in one location and go to the other 3 and return, and it would be a nice outing, and it would take the good part of a day. And there's certainly plenty of history throughout the Hudson, including in each of the communities in which they are built, that there's plenty to put in any one of them. Lighthouse displays or river displays or any number of things. And I think, again, the interest in seeing the light is a good part of the draw. That's how it began.
The public response, how has it been as far as people sympathetic and contributing and getting involved?
The response in the various communities, for example, in Hudson, they've done a lot of work there, and they've been able to assemble some displays because one of the last families to live in the lighthouse still is a local family, and they have been able to provide some information and some memorabilia, as well as the people in Saugerties who have fought a long, hard battle for their lighthouse, have been able to gain some significant funds from foundations, and they have begun their restoration process there, but they will take a few more years to complete the major project that they've begun. But there is a good deal of interest, and it's been non-stop for the last 4 years or so. So you can see that had it been a passing fancy, it would have long been over by now. But I think they'll achieve their success. It will take a while, and it will be something that will cause a lot of people a lot of heartache along the way, but it's something that can be done, and I've thought that for a long time.
Okay, where's the loot? I don't remember. What do you mean? Well, do you remember?
That was 26 years ago. First we had lunch.
Now I remember.
Yeah.
Freihoffer's fresh rye bread.
Soft, delicious hamburger buns.
Chewy oatmeal cookies.
Now remember where we left the car?
What car?
Fryhoffers, always as good as you remember.
Okay, Mrs. Clark. Where were you that afternoon?
I can't remember. It was years ago.
Then let me help you. It was around lunchtime.
Oh, I do remember.
Finally!
I had a sandwich with soft, fresh baked Fryhoffers bread. They make so many, you know. And then a piece of their scrumptious cake. And their oatmeal cookies. Moist, chewy.
Who did you have lunch with?
Oh, I can't remember that.
Fryhoffers,
Always as good as you remember.
There are only 2 operational lighthouses left on the Hudson River. Situated on the west side of the main river channel between the city of Hudson in Columbia County and the village of Athens in Greene County is the Hudson-Athens Lighthouse. When the sun goes down, an automation system activates its light. Once left to decay, this structure is well on its way to being restored to its original state. Lynn Brunner is president of the Hudson-Athens Lighthouse Preservation Society, and her passion for these navigational beacons began with her husband, Bob, who was born in the Hudson-Athens Lighthouse.
The lighthouse was built in 1873. It was started by a firm, Powley and Gage from Hudson, and Noon and Madden of Kingston finished the building the following year, and it opened in November 14th, 1874. The reason for the lighthouse being in the position it's in is you see the flats that are over here, and Hudson was an old whaling town, and through the years they've had many boats that have grounded on the flats there, and so the people petitioned Congress in 1872 for a lighthouse to be built here, and $35,000 was appropriated for the lighthouse, and that's how she came to be. The first lighthouse keeper was a Best, and he served on it with his son as a total for 44 years. It was in the Best family. And then the next lighthouse keeper was August Kellberg, and he lived in Athens. And then the next was Emil Brunner, who retired in 1949.
The Hudson-Athens is the northernmost lighthouse between New York Harbor and Albany. It is about 115 miles north of New York City. This unique house was well equipped in its day with all the necessities for a family to live comfortably.
She has 1,600 square feet in it. It has 8 rooms with a full basement and cistern underneath downstairs. It's also above the water level. There are 4 bedrooms upstairs. Downstairs is a kitchen, a small bathroom that was aerated in the 1930s, and an oil room and a sitting room and the kitchen. You asked me about facilities before, and that's the spot where they would have had the outhouse. When the building was first built, that was the sanitary facilities. The water was pumped into the river when they put the other sanitary facilities in.
The Hudson-Athens Lighthouse Preservation Society has a 20-year lease with the U.S. Coast Guard. This landmark lease was signed February 15, 1984. It marked the first time a lease was signed with a government agency and a private group for a Hudson River lighthouse.
The reason for this is they were going to dismantle these buildings. I asked them what would happen if they found this to be surplus, and the captain from there said they would totally just take the building down and put up nothing but a steel tower. So that's how we got involved in it. We wanted to see it restored before it was beyond the point of no return, like some of the other lighthouses that have been declared surplus and just destroyed.
In keeping with her high hopes of someday restoring the lighthouse, Lynn, along with many volunteers, have already put on numerous hours of long work on this building.
First thing we did was tear off the boards. There were boards covering all of the windows so we could get some light in and see what condition it was in. We also restored the roof that was leaking. We did put storm windows and restored the windows, and we've done some of the brickwork and some of the deck work that you've seen in the building. As we raise the funds, we redo the building step at a time.
The last lighthouse keeper to live on the Hudson-Athens Lighthouse was Emil Brunner. Now 93, he, along with his family, lived in the house until the 1950s, at which time the lighthouse was automated and manned facility was no longer a necessity. 5 of his children grew up here, and Bob Brunner is one of them.
As you can see, there's not much room here for them to play. So most of their games were here on the deck, climbing up the brick corner work, which would scare my mother to death, and playing hide and seek, trying to catch each other. But and fishing, they'd done a lot of fishing off the thing. My father would limit them to the size of the fish so they wouldn't have too many fish around. But other than that, there wasn't too many other things for them to do, except read and things like this.
Many of the modern conveniences that we have today were not available in the lighthouses.
The water was come from a cistern. The water, you caught the rainwater on the roof, and it was diverted down into the cistern in the cellar. And that was your main water supply. And if you did run out of water, they had to bring water by boat to you from one of the tenders. You'd have to get in contact with New York, and they'd bring water up for you, so you'd have your water. You had a coal fire system at that time, and your coal was brought in to the lighthouse. And they had an oil barrel here on the deck that was a great big oil barrel, a 1,000-gallon oil barrel that was here, and they used that for their lamps and for their whatever other use they had in the lighthouse, the heating at times. But they were self-contained. Then you had to go to shore. You try to keep a couple of week food supply on board in case the river froze over and you couldn't get ashore. In the springtime, the same way. When it was breaking up, you couldn't get ashore, so you had to have food here to maintain yourself.
As we mentioned, the keeper of the lighthouse, Bob's father, was in charge of operating and maintaining the light in the tower, also the fog bell. This 1891 bell, still controlled by a weight system, is the last operating in the country.
The light had to be lit during your dark hours, and at that time, everything was by weights. You had to wind up the weight system so that these would last on the lights for around 6 hours, and so you would have to wind this up a couple times, get up in the middle of the night and rewind it, make sure everything was running. And it was oil lamps, so you had to make sure everything with oil was filled up. And the same way with the bell, it was all on a weight system, so you had to make sure this was all wound up and ready to go. And you had to check it this so many hours to make sure everything was all right. And you couldn't get much sleep when it was foggy out because it was ringing every 15 seconds, so it kept you quite awake.
There is an aura of mystery surrounding lighthouses. For Bob, the river is the key that unlocks memories of days gone by.
Getting coming out here and being with my father, and you're listening to the different noises of the river. Today it's like now you can hear the trains in the background. At that time you had lots of trains running by. You had the Grand Central used to run up through here. You'd be waiting. You'd could almost set your clock by the different trains that would be coming through, and you could hear them coming up. Today there's not as much. There's more traffic on the river, but it's not the same.
The Hudson-Athens Lighthouse Preservation Society has high hopes for its unique structure. One day soon, the society plans to open it to the public as a museum to show what life was like for the dedicated lighthouse keeper and his family. The other 3 upper Hudson lighthouses also have a bright future. Elise Berry, the architectural consultant, says she's prepared to take the steps necessary to restore these historic landmarks.
Well, there's always something that has to come in your way, and then there's always a way around it. You just have to find it. You just have to know that in the long term it's going to serve a tremendous purpose, and that it's something that will never happen again. It's not an error that we will ever see. And most of us never knew this era anyway. And there are a lot of people coming into this area who are not local residents, who will be making this their home, who have no experience with lighthouses of this kind or any kind. And so it will serve a great educational purpose as the years go by. And as I say, it's something that will never happen again. So we need to capture what we have left.
And of course, that's not all we have left, because there is the Wilderstein Mansion. You may have said, now, where did I see Elise before? Well, it was about a year ago this time when we visited Wilderstein, and Elise told us about her involvement in that project. And she wishes to remind us that the Wilderstein Mansion will have another open house the weekend of December 5th and 6th. That'll be Saturday and Sunday from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. Thanks for coming aboard this time. We'll be back again next week, same time and place, right here on the river.
Tonight on the Sunday Night Movie, watch Brooke Shields and Christopher Atkins in The Blue Lagoon. Tonight at 8 on WTZA.